So the argument that we should just simply equate peace with anti-war doesn't hold up to the statistics. Now, in talking about this rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century, there was a gentleman by the name of Brink Lindsay from the Cato Institute. And he wrote an essay back in 2001. It's called The Last Totalitarians. And this is from which I took the title of this presentation, The Last Totalitarians. And I want to quote from his article for just a second here. He says, now he's referring to the Islamic terrorists, Al-Qaeda and stuff like that, and putting them in context. At first glance, shadowy Islamist terrorists look very different from any enemy we have ever faced. And indeed, the tactics they have employed are novel, as are the tactics that must be used to defeat them. But the fundamental nature of our present adversaries, once seen plainly, is all too familiar. The evil that we confront today is the evil of totalitarianism. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and their co-conspirators are the modern-day successors of Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Mao, and Pol Pot. The atrocities of today's terrorists are the last shudder of a historical convulsion of unprecedented fury and destructive power. It was spawned by the spiritual confusion that accompanied the coming of the modern age, and consists of a profound hostility toward the disciplines and opportunities of human freedom. With the collapse of the Soviet Empire, we thought we were done with totalitarianism, but it still lives, and it lives to do harm. As we prepare once more to fight this old and dangerous adversary, we need to reacquaint ourselves with its origins and nature. Now, there's 2 points he wants to bring up here, he does bring up here that I want to cover. One point is that the rise of totalitarianism is a response to and a reaction to the notion of human freedom, the presenting and the expansion of the ideas of human freedom. As Mussolini said, the 19th century was the century of the individual. And this ideology is diametrically opposed to the ideology of socially engineered collectivized utopia. You cannot create the socially engineered utopia if you're going to allow individuals to go their own way, and because they don't fit into the plan. And so the idea of individual liberty and going your own way presents an existential threat to the utopian collectivist ideologies that eventually lead to totalitarianism. So they are initially opposed in a war of ideas. And you had throughout much of the 19th century, the latter half of the 19th century, as we talked about last time, there was a war of ideas going on, a conflict of visions. But as the totalitarianism moves from an evolutionary approach to a revolutionary approach, the conflict moves from a conflict of vision and a war of ideas to something far more serious. And this is, where lives are literally at stake and war takes place, and you have death camps, and you have, because anything can be justified. Lenin once said the ends justify the means. Because your ends are so noble and are going to bring about this ideal, then a few deaths here and there is worth the price, because you're going to bring about this utopian society. You gotta, in order to make an omelet, you got to crack a few eggs, and so that's the mindset. And this is how this kind of thing is justified. So that's one. So there is a search for reasons as to why we're being attacked many times. Well, they don't like our policy, our foreign policy. They, meaning the Soviets, the Nazis. This is modern day terrorists, Al-Qaeda's, but this was back during the Cold War. They're saying the same thing. They were saying the same thing when Hitler was coming to power. Well, maybe if we were somehow engage in more diplomacy, or we were less imperialistic in our foreign policy, or maybe it's because of their poverty. Oh yeah, there are people rising up out of poverty. Well, bin Laden was a multimillionaire and came from a very rich, prominent Saudi family, and many of the jihadi leaders, although maybe not as prominent as bin Laden, come from this kind of background. So they're hardly the children of underprivileged, people running in the street and stuff like that that are in poverty and are rising up because of their oppression. No, they have an ideological agenda that they are hell-bent on establishing. And that is what motivates them. To assume that they're just reacting to our policies is selling them short, and is also not justified by any reading of their own writings. So that's one thing, that they're motivated in a twofold. One is to oppose this idea of individual liberty, and two is to impose their own vision of what is going to bring about the utopia. So this is what motivates. Now, what constitutes this utopia is going to differ from the Nazis to the communists to the fascists to the Islamic radicals. Now they're going to differ amongst themselves, and eventually they're probably going to come into conflict with themselves. But the fact that they have a socially engineered, centrally organized, and collective utopia that they want to establish is where they all come and have this all in common. And the fact that their utopia that they are planning cannot allow the existence of individual liberty and some of these other things in order for it to be implemented is something they also have in common. The one other thing that he mentions, he calls this the last totalitarianism, and he refers to it as the last convulsion of this shudder of totalitarianism. There I think he may be being a little bit more optimistic than what I think is relevant, because it may be the last totalitarians if we win the war of ideas. But if we lose the war of ideas, they will not be the last. You can get on that. And he talked about when the Cold War ended, when the Soviet Union fell, we thought we were done with it. And we could probably have been, because at that time, the world was looking for the U.S. and looking to the pro-freedom forces for answers. And there was a vacuum of ideas. And there was, Michael Ledeen has wrote a book called Freedom Betrayed. He talked about how we led this global movement for freedom and then walked away from it. And during this period of time, wasn't long after the fall of the Soviet Union where you saw the 1993 was the first attempt at the World Trade Center bomb, and they tried to, and there was a truck full of explosives at the foundations. They tried to take it out then. And so there was an attempt to fill this vacuum. And Ledeen thinks, and I tend to agree with him, that they wouldn't have gained much of a following around the world had they not went into an ideological vacuum. If we would have seized the moment following the fall of the Berlin Wall, following the collapse of communism, and promoted a pro-freedom offensive through the internet, similar to what we did during the Cold War with Radio Free America, Radio Free Europe and Radio America, an ideological offensive, I don't think we would be in the straits we are national security-wise now. So when you lose the war of ideas, you end up in a much more dire national security situation. And I think that's one example. I think Ledeen is right. I think we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are now if we would have fought the war of ideas then. Well, 20/20 hindsight, we didn't. And now we're in this situation today. And it's getting worse. But there are signs that the totalitarian entity is cracking. But that's no guarantee that something else doesn't take its place. Just like the Soviet Union fell apart, communism fell apart, look what we got now. They didn't see it coming. But you create an ideological vacuum, and what's going to fill it? So I want to go into now the ideology of radical Islam. And because if you're going to wage this war of ideas, you've got to know yourself, but you also have to know your enemy. And so the radical Islamic ideology looks to a gentleman by the name of Sayyid Qutb as one of their Martin Luther-like figures. He is seen as being a reformer who got rid of all of these foreign influences in Islamic thinking and went back to the original Quran. Now the reformers within Islam, or the moderate Muslims, would argue that he took more from people like Lenin than he did from the Quran. So there's an argument, but as to whether or not he's a genuine reformer. But